Yes. So we have one extra.
Okay.
And
Oh, that's enough.
Why is it blue? Because it's sheets and not paintings.
No, you always look at the committee.
ah,
No. You can say
I can increase it a little bit.
yes. No, the means that's it.
Roberta is on the wall as well, yeah. So there are not even enough lady professors to fill all the pictures.
Oh,
but I think it's more
Lisa.
comfortable. It's more comfortable like this when I think Justus Scaliger is there.
Yeah,
Yes.
it looks so severe with the old guys.
So I have this little book of that's actually what are my drafts for the answers to Sterlinger, which I then use.
Mm-hmm.
And perhaps following this is not very how many claims I don't have a very good handwriting.
So these about the Stellinger, the one reads and the other flips open.
I so if they
Aura?
Sorry, I'm listening. Yeah.
So if one of the Stellingers asked the one who does not read and flips open the book, the notebook, so all these possible answers are
No, nothing here. Yes, one more time, please.
like so I think I have this and
Yes,
this
sir.
and a book. So if they ask about the Sterlinger, the procedure is that the parent will read.
Yes.
So I think Alan will read the first.
No, otherwise.
Otherwise.
Yeah.
And then the other four, and you will read the first four, and then the other one will have the book, and if there's
So if I read number 4, you start browsing, and
Yeah,
you
yeah,
read number
okay.
3, I start browsing.
Yes. Okay.
oh no, I think I can. I know you will have a hard time installing one here and
Yes,
then.
you know you don't have any hurry. You have the time ahead.
Yes.
So you will be fine.
But how is this?
Emergency procedure.
Ja, de omruiming. Ja. Ja, zou kunnen. I think so.
She walks the candidate into the room.
Have a sip of this water.
Yeah.
Magic water.
Good luck. We're going to.
If any of you two eventually find certainly one, I cannot promise that I will follow the protocol.
Well, it will be a long time before I will know.
How is the
And I have to quit in May.
it's like the end of the protocol.
I know the end of the month. It usually comes sooner in linguistics.
Oh God. So do you want to? But why? I mean, you will make an excellent classicist.
No, I wouldn't make an excellent anything. Because my mind is still a mess. It's just I do
And
this
there's also an Gert. There's also an Gert.
Meneer de kandidaat, you confront a committee which was appointed by the Council of Deans and that is charged with the task of examining both your dissertation and the thesis submitted therewith. Dr. Kalsbeek from the University of Amsterdam, who is a guest at this table, and I welcome her heartily, will open the discussion.
Meneer de kandidaat, the main issues addressed in your dissertation are important and interesting, and the speculative hypothesis at the end of the conclusions is original. So, my congratulations to the author for writing a valuable contribution to a study of Serbian and Croatian historical accentology. You have shown that the dialect of Dubrovnik underwent 3 separate retractions of the accent. The first retraction of the accent was from open final syllables. The later one was from closed final syllables, and finally there was a retraction from word internal syllables. You took Della Bella's 1728 dictionary as a starting point and compared the accentuation in this work with older Dubrovnik texts, for instance, Ranjina, Marin Busic, and with works from later periods up to the 19th century, for instance, Budmani's 1883 description of the dialect of Dubrovnik. The absolute chronology of the stages of accent retraction, as reflected in these texts, confirm the relative chronology of stages of accent retraction that Pavle Ivić and Resetar before him, I would add, or maybe you would say Resetar, found by comparing accent retraction patterns in Stokavian dialects. The speculative hypothesis you referred to in your conclusion is that that the last accent retraction and the second one can be linked to 2 major demographic shifts in the city of Dubrovnik, when there were influxes of East Herzegovinian speakers with accent retraction after the demographic losses in the earthquake of 1667 and after the fall of the Ragusa Republic in 1808. This would imply that the last phase of accent retraction in the dialect of Dubrovnik took place fairly recently, an interesting idea. Besides the congratulations on the major points you made, there are a few remarks I have and a few points I would like to discuss with you. It is very clear that this book is the result of an admirably huge amount of philological labor. But I have some remarks. The first remark concerns clarity of exposition and communication with your readers. For instance, the very first sentence of the introduction of your book on page 1 is Serbo-Croatian accentuation bears a remarkably distinct stamp of accent retraction. I think such a sentence should, of course, at least have included the word historical accent retraction and or the phrase as compared with all stages of the language. Because the way you put these things leaves the unprepared reader a little puzzled. Retraction should be linked to something, connected with something. Otherwise, in a synchronic situation, we don't know what to do with it. And then Pavle Ivic's 6 positions, or more than 6, are not really a method, as you call them, but a schematic representation of the hierarchy that appears to exist in syllable structures with respect to susceptibility to accent retraction. And also a question, why do you present Ivic's criteria in reverse order? That is, first the quantity of the vowel in question, and then the question of open versus closed syllables, while Ivic has the other way around. Then I would have a remark on, with respect to the controllability of the data from your primary sources. There are practically no introductions or accompanying remarks to the sources or explanations of the interpretation, of your interpretation of their notation systems. And then I come to a general question. I know this question is somewhat beside the scope of your book, but as the role of East Herzegovina speakers is so important in your discussion, I would like to hear your opinion on possible causes of the Neo-Slovakian accent retraction. It is remarkable that East Herzegovina should be the center of Neo-Stogavian accent retraction, with the most drastic, complete accent retraction, while the periphery shows more retention of original accents, a notion that is implicit in Ivic's work. In a Leiden Societas Linguistica talk some years ago, Willem Vermeer put forward the idea, which is still unpublished, that the language of the Vlachs could have played a role in the accent retraction. We would have to assume that Neo-Stogavian accent retraction could be the result of shift by people who were not used to an ictus on a final syllable, so who perceived a rising tone instead on the preceding syllable. So if we would assume a role for the Vlachs here, they could have been speakers of an archaic type of Romanian with no accents on final syllables. We would also have to assume that carriers of the accent retraction were in principle inhabitants of mountainous regions, whereas inhabitants of typical agricultural regions retained more of the original accentual situation. Of course, more data would be required to corroborate this idea. An interesting parallel of accent retraction in dialects of the Serbian and Croatian continuum spoken in the neighborhood of Romanian is found on Krk and in Istria, where Trakavian, Ekavian dialects show accent retraction in areas where a mixed population with Romanians exist. Would you think this is a plausible explanation?
Their opponents, while I fully admit that there are a few perhaps shortcomings that you mention in the thesis, I would like to address them and connect them with some of the stellinga that they are related. And by the way, I am delighted that you should bring up the subject of the Vlach language for the reason that currently, unbeknownst to anybody, I think, on the table, I'm writing a book on it in the places of Majdanpek and Bor in Serbia. And I should like to speak about this in the end of this answer, but first to address the first part of your question, which may be linked with stelling 4, which, as you perhaps can see, claims that there is a certain correlation in between accent retraction and demographic changes which affected the dialect of the Dubrovnik in the other half of the 16th century and the first half of the 19th century. But, well, as it is obvious, this telling can be broken into claims. First, that accent retraction is indeed, was at its peak in the 19th century. How do we prove this? There is a problem here because the continuity of scientific research of the Dubrovnik dialects starts in 1818 with the first editions of book Retraction, and is continued throughout the 19th century until the year 1883, when the first monography was published on this subject by Pero Budmani. Before this period, we have what is called pre-modern research of the subject, so to say, a number of dictionaries, which you can all find in the thesis and other books, which for some reason or the other mark the accent. When the dictionaries are at hand, it is quite understandable why these people, their authors, decided to mark the accents in these dictionaries, but for instance, it is perfectly beyond me why should the anonymous transcriber of a so-called Pucic manuscript, which contains all the comedies of Držić, be so persistent as to mark all of the lengths on the words in all of the places with such admirable accuracy that perhaps armed with all sorts of dictionaries that we have today and grammars and descriptions, I think we could scarcely reproduce the same product. Well, as I say, this is the problem. And this thesis goes about solving it in this way. Compare the last of the pre-modern dictionaries with the first of the modern scientific research studies and see what is the difference. Now, as you can see probably from the tables which are found in chapter 3 on pages 210 there is a quite persistent tendency to keep the accent unretracted in almost all positions in which the original accent was found on the long syllable, which is a tendency that is preserved throughout the 16th, the 17th, and the 19th century. As opposed to this, book Retraction of 1818 shows all of the accents in all of the positions retracted. Now, this is really an astonishing feat of historical linguistics, if you will, that all of the accents have shifted in between 1806, when Stully was published, and 1818, when Vuk was published. But then you can say, okay, so I do not believe Vuk, there must be something wrong with it. He probably...
Yeah, there could be.
Well, I mean, it's one way of looking at things, because as you know, Vuk's Retraction of 1818 mostly contains the lexicon of Boka Kotorska, which even today has mostly the unretracted accent, whereas in Vuk 1818 all of the accents are retracted. Yeah. So you can say, okay, he clearly noted the words with the accent of his own native dialect, which indeed, Vuk being from East Herzegovina, was extremely progressive in terms of accent retraction. So you can say it's a kind of, it doesn't really correspond to the actual situation on the, in Dubrovnik or in Boka Kotorska at the time. But the problem is, you see this, Vuk, while noting words from different dialects, did not visit Dubrovnik until 1836. We know this from the fact that Srpske poslovice were published in 1836, exactly after he visited Dubrovnik, and as you know, the sound age made a return in Serbo-Croatian orthography, which was prompted exactly by the Dubrovnik dialect, where it is kept as opposed to other dialects, but also where Vuk now, having the direct experience from the people in Dubrovnik, marks the accent, and it is still retracted in 1836 as it was in Vuk 1818. Now, even if this is not enough, and if the collective dictionary, the third edition of 1854, which was published by Vuk and Danicic together, is not enough, then we have as a crown evidence the fact that Pero Budmani, who was a native, scholar native to Dubrovnik, was born in 1836. So the same year when Srpske poslovice were published, and in his monography on the Dubrovnik dialect, which is at the same time the first monography of an Enish-Topelian dialect, the accent is retracted. And in Rešetar, the accent is retracted likewise.
Okay,
and
I'm going to interrupt you now.
Yes.
Because you have presented several arguments, and I would like to turn to another examiner.
Yes.
Yeah? Okay, we can come back later perhaps to this, but now the discussion will be continued by Professor D'Alessandro.
Meneer de kandidaat, let me tell you that I really admire your patience and your thoroughness. This is an impressive work. I don't know, I didn't think there would be people in the modern world still doing this kind of things with such care, really. This is really impressive. Congratulations. It's also challenging, you must admit, especially for people who are not extremely fluent in the problem of Serbo-Croatian accent retraction. But I'm very curious about your opinion about some things that you describe here and there. So, at some point you say that accent retraction took place for several reasons, external reasons other than internal reasons, and one of them is the fact that you have a lot of immigrants from Herzegovina. Now, and they had something that much more advanced. So my first question is, in general, it is a bit strange, normally, according to what we know about contact, that you get influenced by the people that come to you rather than them adapting to your system. So I would like to know first what the reason is why the people that were in Dubrovnik adapted. And the second reason is a general reason about how you think contact works. So, because all you presented in your table is rules. And you say, okay, this is gradual. Things happen gradually, first in this position, then in the other position. But rules are universal. And contact is word by word, more or less. So what is your idea about how contact influences a rule? So how do you pass from a word by word to a generalized rule that holds in every context?
Hooggeleerde opponents. I am again very delighted that you should ask such a question, which is directly linked to the previous question, so that I can more or less answer both of these questions. And I should like to say, in respect with the population and people who come influencing the people who are native, well, we must first discuss numbers, so to get some idea of scale. When we say the Republic of Ragusa, I mean Dubrovnik and that which historically belongs to it, so Konavle in the south and Primorje in the north. In 1851, an Austrian statistician called Karl von Zernig made statistical research and discovered that at this point Dubrovnik had 5,000 people living in it. So it wasn't a big city. And the entire zone of Dubrovnik, of the Republic of Dubrovnik, had something like 10,000 people. So perhaps, I don't know, if Leiden has 50,000 people, it's 1/5 of it. So that you do not need an enormous mass of speakers to influence a mass of 5,000 speakers. So that's the first thing we should have in mind. Really, at 1851, after the major influx of people in Dubrovnik, there was still only 5,000 people in Dubrovnik. We should ask ourselves how many people lived in Dubrovnik in perhaps the 16th and the 17th century. And if we now just disregard the objective number of capacity that the city within its wall holds, there are claims, mostly literary, after the disastrous earthquake of 1667, that something like 3,000 people were killed by it, and 3,000 people were supposed to be something like 4/5. So that the population in the 16th and the 17th century would be something like, I don't know, 4,000 people or so. And then you ask, after the people who moved arrived, what kind of contacts, how did this work in terms of contact? The same idea is presented with the Vlachs. Now in the Vlach language, the accent is exactly where it was in Latin, except in few words. In the dialect of Boden-Meiderpec, which I'm studying currently, only one word has accent, which is not identical to the Latin, is the word inima, which is Latin anima. So they pronounce it inima. So this is the only, yes. But the thing is that in all Latin O stems, they lose the Latin U of the the accusative singular, which became the stem, and then the universal case. So that it appears that most of the O stems, which are most copious, have an accent which is oxytonic. In this respect, contact with the Vlach language would actually support the unretracted, the preservation of accent on the original place, in as much we are speaking about accent paradigm B, which has the desinential accent. I do not call it here the accent paradigm B, but should you have a word and the accent is on the ending or the end, is the accent paradigm B. Or for instance, if you have a long word and then a stem has more than one syllables, it can be accent paradigm A on a letter syllable. And constantly it is being said in respect with accent retraction that some sort of contact must have induced it. Having examined this possibility, which is a claim made by certain older scholars who study the same question. I do not think this is so. It is my theory, which is nowhere expounded in the book, but I still hold it, that for whatever reasons, Proto-Slavic tones in East Herzegovina, where accent retraction is most progressive, were for some reason realized on the syllable before the syllable.
So you don't believe it's contact then?
No, I do not
You believe in case it's reinforcement, but it's not
I
contact?
have a footnote. So you see,
A footnote in your answer. Very good.
Yes, you should always have footnotes. You see, I do believe that certain retractions were a result of a contact, and that is to say, you have the dialect of East Herzegovina where the accent retraction is not acting, and this is good. But accent retraction in almost all other dialects of Serbo-Croatian happens as a result of the contact of the dialect of East Herzegovina with the dialect of Vojvodina. This is a very famous case, with the dialect of Dubrovnik, and with all of those dialects which were bordering to the people who, after the Battle of Kosovo 1389, fled the original living space of East Herzegovina, mostly to the north, in Vojvodina, to the west, towards Krk and so forth, Lika particularly.
So the question is, basically your answer is, this is a reinforcement of what was already there. So
yes,
the general
so
theoretical question is...
I believe that accent retraction was prompted by contact, but not by alloglottic contact, so contact of Serbo-Croatian with some other language, rather contact of that dialect in which, for whatever reason, the accents were retracted, and all other Serbo-Croatian dialects which had the unretracted.
Okay. Thank you. The examination will be continued by Professor Roorek.
Meneer de kandidaat, I agree with the other examiners that have spoken until now that this is a very impressive piece of work. It's painstakingly detailed. It is really impressive that young scholars can still, muster the patience and the attention for detail for this kind of work. I don't think I would be capable of it myself, I must say. It is also, like my predecessor, this is also not my area of expertise, but I would like to ask you a few more general questions in that regard. On page, towards the end, I think it's 214, you sort of state all of the factors that you think play a role in accent retraction. And I was particularly interested in number 6. You say, once in action, accent retraction appears to follow a set of guidelines. The accent retreats more readily from short than from long syllables, too long than to short syllables, from final than from non-final syllables, from open than from closed syllables. Now, you call these guidelines and not rules, and knowing your attention for detail, you must have had a reason for that. So my question would be exactly this. Why don't you say that these are more general rules? Or to put it differently, can you think of other cases, either in the diachrony of Indo-European or any other language family, or in other language systems, where you see this kind of accent retraction phenomena at work, on the one hand, and on the other hand, so that's one part of the question, and the other part of the question is, do you think that these guidelines could be generalized to rules that would be applicable anywhere when a phenomenon of accent retraction takes place? So this is the more general theoretical question. Is this, what do you predict? Do you predict these guidelines to be universal, and in some sense of universal? And if so, how and where and why?
Hooggeleerde opponents, thank you very much for the kind words, and specifically to the attention to detail and the reference to the point 6 on page 214. Now, using this astonishing ability for detail, I attract your attention to page 6, where in EndNote 12. At the very end of the page, you see the term guidelines referred to as priority lanes in quote marks, in quotation marks. So yes, I use these two terms, which are perhaps a bit liberal on their own, priority lanes and guidelines. And the reason why I do it is actually you can ask yourself, is accent retraction instantaneous or is it gradual? If it is gradual, how can we prove this? Well, there are two ways of proving it. You can prove it either philologically or linguistically. The way to prove it philologically, well, it is this. You go to the old sources and then you try tracking every single little shift in every single little book. But more interestingly, you can prove it linguistically. Now, how is this done? Well, instead of using a book of Della Bella, you use the book of dialects, which are generally attested throughout the Serbo-Croatian speaking area. And you find that certain dialects, unlike others, are at this stage of accent retraction, and the other ones are at the other end. And comparing these dialects, and this is really the work that was done by Ivic, Ivšić, Rešetar, Budmani, and so forth. I did not have to do it, it is not my at all, is the observation that most significantly in terms of Ivic, that all of the dialects seem to follow some general principles. That is to say that if you have position 1 and position 1a, what I call position 1 and 1a, the only difference in between the two of them is whether or not the protonic syllable is long. And Ivšić, on the basis of the book of the dialects, finds that it is true that certain dialects which have retraction in position 1a do not have the retraction in position 1, whereas the opposite never happens. So in terms
That's
of
why I would say rules rather than guidelines.
So in terms of the general question that you asked me, perhaps it would be the best to compare this sort of behavior to the Universalia of Jakobson. So, for instance, you know, you get a Universalia saying no language will have a B which does not have a P, and then you find out it's Arabic or something, you know. But generally, it holds for the enormous amount of languages, and it holds for enormous amount of dialects in terms of Serbo-Croatian. So you ask, could we perhaps make a general rule? Well, I would...
or rules and subsets of rules, and
yes,
it would be
yes,
ordered
yes.
in a certain, so that you stop certain. You know, I'm a systematician, I'm a theoretician, right? So
Yeah, that's clear.
I will try to answer you by contradicting myself.
couldn't ask.
So if I say, for instance, on the basis of the Bromnik, on the basis of Serbo-Croatian accent retraction, we may now imply that the position 1a in all languages will more likely attract accent than not, then it would mean that any situation in which you have a protonic syllable stress would be more likely to, more likely to attract the stress than the other way around. And then comes the contradiction. Compare the aeolic baritonesis. The exact opposite happens. Now, if we take the Proto-Indo-European first-person singular of the verb I am, so as me, regularly in aeolic it becomes emmi, emmi, short a, mmi, whereas in Doric, which has a kind of lengthening based on the cluster SM, in order to lengthen the A to a long A, eta, has a mi. So that Doric actually in this case has position 1A, as opposed to aeolic, which has baritonesis, and in position 1, not 1A, retracts the accent. But then you may ask yourself, are the causes of accent retraction in aeolic the same as in Serbo-Croatian?
And that's a very good cliffhanger, because now we continue and we shall turn to another examiner, and that's Dr. Derksen.
Meneer de kandidaat, the book is for a non-specialist very hard to read, but nevertheless I think it's clear it's a major contribution to accentology. So many congratulations on that. Just that I sometimes need a little help when reading this book. I have a question regarding statement 5 on page 214. It's about the dialect of Molise in Italy. You say, since accent retraction is recorded in the dialect of Serbo-Croatian immigrants of Molise, Italy, it is clear that probably the retraction, must have been prior to the migration, but the exact date is unknown. And then you have a footnote stating that it's probably around 1500, so give or take. This dialect, this Molise dialect, is said to be close to Istrian dialects, Icavian Istrian dialects that have been classified as either Southeast Icavian or Stocavian. That's at least what I found. So in Molise, we find, according to Rechatar's description, I looked it up mainly because I own the book, we find forms with attracted stress, forms with so-called doppelbetonung. So that's a high syllable followed by a stress syllable, let's say stress syllable with a higher peak of intensity. And you have forms without attraction. And, well, based on, I also think he says, Rechatar says it explicitly, but it's clear from the examples that the latter two, so the doppelbetonung and the unattracted stress, mainly occur when a syllable that retains the old place of the stress is long and the preceding syllable, directly preceding syllable, is short. You have already explained a lot today, but I'd still like to ask you, how does this relate to the older stages of Dubrovnik accentuation, as well as to your hypothesis that accent retraction is indigenous and to East Herzegovina and, well, nowhere else, I think. Well, at least not indigenous to Dubrovnik.
Thank you very much. Hooggeleerde opponents. I will try to answer in a similar fashion. So the question regards a Croatian or Serbo-Croatian colony in Cruč, Italy, which is Croatia, and the fact that they too have, according to the description of Rechatar, somewhat of accent retraction. Now, since it would be highly uneconomical to suppose that accent retraction happened on its own in both Serbo-Croatian and Molise, after they have moved, it is only logical that we should suppose that accent retraction actually happened before they moved. The only question is where did they move from? And this is the big mystery in this question. So you perhaps know that there is an alternative theory saying that they must have moved from the Neretva river valley, which is quite a far way, is quite distant from Istria at any rate. And they must have, in a way, came from the same mythical and mystical place where Jakub Mikael's Blago came from. We have a contingent of these people who claim to be Bosnian and as a rule move to Italy, publish a book called the dialect Bosnian, but do not actually say where did they come from. So my theory in this case, which is the one which Rechatar based on the fact that they do still preserve some little speck of folk poetry, and that this folk poetry is best compared not to the folk poetry of Istria, but rather to the folk poetry of Herzegovina, that they actually moved from somewhere between Makarska in Primorje, south to Split and the Neretva Valley. It would seem dialectologically to fit the profile of the language. And like the dialect of Dubrovnik, they must have at some point suffered a contact with dialects which are very progressive in terms of accent retraction. And it is this retraction that it is recorded by Rechatar in Molise in the 19th century. I seem to remember from memory that the retraction in Malese only happens in position 1A, 7A, 7, and so forth. So only in those positions in which the accent retraction, where it is found, it is always found. It seems to me to be the case.
Okay.
Yeah, the retraction. Yeah, that's right. I think. Yeah.
Okay. Thank you. The examination shall be continued by Dr. Pronk-Tiethoff.
Meneer de kandidaat, I shall skip my words of praise because they will only repeat those of my colleagues. Della Bella was, of course, no native speaker of the language, and he collected his material from different sources. I would be very interested to hear your opinion on the reliability of and the variety in Della Bella's material. For example, on page 24 of your dissertation, in type Bossau, we see a large variety in forms. There is kabal, with AO, then koto, osso, with acute accent, and ossal on AL. How do you explain these forms?
Zeer geleerde opponents. We come to the big flaw of the book. And I'm rather happy it is so, because it is also a subject of a new paper of mine. That is to say, which dialect is the dialect that Della Bella actually described, because I do not believe for a moment that it was only the dialect of the Bromnic. Now, you may ask me, how can I prove this? I can prove this very simply. By comparing this thesis to a previous thesis of mine, which I wrote on the subject of Dalmato-Romance loanwords in Serbo-Croatian. And while doing this other painstaking work, I also did map all of the lemmata with all of the attestations on a map. And it proved to be the case that certain Dalmato-Romance loanwords which are found in Della Bella are not found in the Bromnic at all, in other people who, in other lexicographers in the Bromnic today and so forth. So that the terrain which Della Bella used for his dictionary must have been wider than just the Bromnic. And then we ask ourselves, could we prove this somehow? Did Della Bella move throughout Dalmatia and so forth? And you find that he did. He actually spent quite a lot of time in Split and was probably very familiar with the terrain in between Split and the Bromnic. And at the end of his life, after the dictionary was published, he was a prior in Kotor, I think, or something like this. But did usually correspond to people who were from Kotor and other schoolmasters. Especially in this type Konats, I do not believe for a moment that those examples which show a descendential accent actually
Type
come...
Possau. Not type Konats?
Possau and Konats are the same type.
Oh, right. Okay.
The only difference is that in type Possau, the final consonant that you see in Konats has been vocalized.
Yes, I see.
So that they are actually the same type. It is my hypothesis in the paper that I am writing that this book is somewhat of a categorical mistake, because Della Bella is not only the Bromnic. Most of it certainly is the Bromnic, but not all of it is. And I can prove it in two different ways, additionally, by comparing it to two dictionaries which are most certainly only the Bromnic. One is found in this book. It is the Dictionarium Latino-Ragosinum of Matijašević, in which, when you compare it to Della Bella, you see a real excess of Karlovački accent, which I call Kano accent, which, if I can link it to a manuscript which I couldn't get, which is now found in Odessa, which contains the first translation of the Bible onto the dialect of the Bromnic. So if I can compare Matijašević and Kašić's translation of the Bible, which is accentuated throughout, and prove that the same amount of accent, Karlovački accent is found in Matijašević as in Kašić, then it would rule most of Della Bella for the Bromnic, at least in those positions in which Della Bella himself does not have chronological design.
Thank you. The examination shall be continued by Dr. Pronk.
Meneer de kandidaat. My question actually regards not Della Bella, but Micalia, but the subject of the question is actually similar to what was just discussed. Micalia, as you, I'm sure, know, was not born in Dubrovnik. He was not a native speaker of the Dubrovnik dialect. Yet you mention his dictionary in your list of works from Dubrovnik, comparing those with Della Bella's work. Micalia did spend 3 years of his life in Dubrovnik, but then moved on to other areas and came into contact with other dialects. That's clear from his dictionary, because it contains, for example, borrowings from Hungarian, which were unlikely to have been present in Dubrovnik. So this is actually a similar situation to what you described just now about Della Bella's dictionary. On the other hand, I can imagine there are reasons to assume that there is Dubrovnik influence in Micalia's dictionary, not only because he cooperated with Bartol Kasic, an important grammarian of his time, but also, well, as I said, because he spent some time there before he started traveling. So there's actually, I can imagine that there's some reason to assume that there would be traces of the Dubrovnik dialect in Micalia's dictionary. Moreover, as the present day most well-known Micalia scholar Gabriel Bagaric says, Micalia's dictionary was a model and a source for Della Bella. So there's a clear connection. But still, I would like to ask you, why do you list Micalia's dictionary in your dissertation? Why do you compare it directly to Della Bella's as if its accentuation is that of Dubrovnik? I'd like to hear your opinion on that.
They declared the opponents. It is true, Jakob Micalia was not from Dubrovnik, but neither was Adelio Della Bella. And but the reasoning is different. And you say Jakob Micalia did spend 3 years. It is true, he spent 3 years in Dubrovnik. He also did spend a week in Temișoara. And in respect to this, and in connection to Vlah, this is how 2 Vlah words creeped into Dalmatian Romance loanwords in Serbo-Croatian, because he probably actually noted them in Temișoara from the autochthonous Vlah population, so that strigliata and koljata, from Latin stringulata and coagulata, made their way in Dalmator Romance as if they were noted in Dubrovnik. Actually, they were noted in Temișoara. Now you ask, why do I include it? Well, I include it for 2 reasons. The first reason is the 3 years spent in Dubrovnik, and the fact that traditionally when Dubrovnik lexica are studied, Micalia is mentioned as well. Here I can refer you to Resheta's paper about Micalia within the lexicography of Dubrovnik. The second, and for me more interesting reason, was for Micalia to act as a control group. Now I know that Micalia came from a place which is not Dubrovnik, which is to the north of Dubrovnik, that the dialect of his lexicon is referred to as Bosnian, and that most likely he was also from something like Neretva River Valley, or whatever. This is also a problem. And that his dialect was less affected by accent retraction than the dialect of Dubrovnik in 1650s when it was published. So my tacit reason for including it is simply as a control group. If you noticed, I nowhere make a claim based on...
Meneer de kandidaat, the time allotted to the examination of your dissertation and its thesis has passed. The committee withdraws in order to deliberate. I request that you and your company await our return here.
Yeah, yeah, but look, I understand well because it looks like it's having a photo. Yeah, exactly.
But I expected this to be but I know he was he's an editor. So
Are you satisfied? Yeah, that's good.
but I'm just saying to him, if he needs a job, I will have a seminar and I will get it.
No, they enter and then you sit, you stand, and then they play you after. No.
Shall we move our chairs and stand behind them?
No. You can stand here. This was supposed to be the... Yeah.
Net uit van de foto en dan kun je ook niet gaan zitten.
Oh,
Dat je echt achter de stoel staat.
oh, oké, is goed.
Ja?
Ja.
Maar jij beweegt gewoon mee met je door en down met de foto.
So I just sit there.
Yeah, you just sit. Yeah, well, we stand when they enter and then you sit. Yeah. Yeah. It's not all. No, only with I think Roberto will leave. I don't know whether. No, I think you just take the thing. No, you sit. Yeah, take your diploma, you sit, and then the datie, and then it's finished. And we leave us first.
So you first, you second, you start 45 minutes.
I think it's you have to go first now because you're on the side.
You were the first one.
That was good. So
How was it?
yeah, that's good. It did very well.
So it was interesting. Like my book is
At the stand, you mean?
Yeah.
Yeah, mine are also very short. I have 10, but shorter.
Do you have the last one? Is it like a joke?
It's a quotation.
What is it?
It's a quotation by Varro. Yeah. The Deriva Latina, of course.
Third book, right?
Yeah.
Is it a secret? Is it a secret?
Oh, you will see in a couple of months.
So,
But they were all very satisfied. We got a lot of compliments.
yeah, but it's the exact opposite of what they write is. But I suppose that it's
It's the same as it's really 19th century style.
You mean the
in a good
comments?
way.
You mean the comments were
because they're all.
But they always have to make points when they
Yeah, but they
when
also
they
say
send
like,
comments.
words, more explain. But this is why I said to explain. This is just so spontaneous. I see.
Oh, no, you have to. And then you see too.
Meneer de kandidaat, we have examined your dissertation and the thesis appended thereto. We have heard your defense and we have considered the report by the faculty concerning your previous study. On the basis of this, we have decided to admit you to the doctorate. Professor Lubotsky is empowered to confer that dignity upon you in the customary fashion.
Volgaarne aanvaard ik de taak mij door de rector magnificus der universiteit opgedragen. Uit kracht dan van de bevoegdheid ons bij wet toegekend, volgens het besluit van de commissie hier tegenwoordig, verklaar ik bij deze u, Orsat Ligorio, te bevorderen tot dokter. Ten bewijze hiervan zal uw diploma door rector, secretaris en de promotores ondertekend en met groot zegel der universiteit bevestigd ter hand worden gesteld. Having completed the duty assigned to me, I may be the first to address you as doctor and congratulate you on the award of the dignity you have obtained. This honorable distinction is a well-deserved and highly valued privilege. At the same time, you are called upon never to lose sight of the obligations it imposes on you in the name of science and society. Dr. Ligorio, dear Orsat, it all started in 2006 when you visited or participated in the first summer school. And you liked it so much that you came a year later, and a year later, and a year later. And in 2009, 2009, I think, yes, you decided that you are almost have your MA, and it would be very nice to write your PhD dissertation under the guidance of Professor Cortland. And you wrote to him and asked whether he would agree to be your supervisor on a topic somewhere in Altaic, Japanese. This was actually the period you wanted to say. So Cortland said that he is going to retire soon, and why don't you ask me for? So I said, okay, but since there was no MA yet and no money to stay, so we postponed the discussion. And then all of a sudden I saw an advertisement that Huygens birds were allotted for the special for Croatian and Chinese students. And that year. And so I persuaded you to apply for it. It was a long story, and it took many months to give you this grant, but eventually you have received it. And in order to enhance your chances, we decided not to write a dissertation on something Indo-European, but together with Cortland, we supervise your dissertation on the dialect of Dubrovnik. So this how it happened that you, in 2010, arrived in the Netherlands and stayed here for 4 years to work on the dissertation. But as you have explained to me on several occasions, you cannot work on one project at the same time. You need at least 10 projects. So you did. First of all, you wrote another dissertation which you defended on the Romance linguistics, which you defended in the University of Zadar. You also worked on Indo-European etymological dictionary here. We have written together a grammar of Phrygian. You have been also working on different translations and also on the dictionary of Meyer-Lübke, digitalization and additions from all kinds of things. So this dissertation is actually some kind of byproduct which you just did in between of all these things. And this makes it even more amazing that it's still there and now, and the Acriby is a very, very special book, and I'm very glad that you have finished it and you defended it is now here. And I would like to congratulate you and your family with this wonderful achievement, and to wish you all the success also in your new job in Belgrade, where you teach classical languages, but also Indo-European now, and maybe also many other subjects. Congratulations.
It's an agreeable duty for me, very learned sir, to congratulate you upon your degree, also on behalf of Leiden University. And herewith I declare the ceremony closed.